This episode of Scandal Water contains adult themes and descriptions of violence. It is not intended for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
This is Andy Angelo, author of the true crime book Dark Highway, and you are listening to Scandal Water,
where the tea is hot and the conversation lively.
Your hosts, Candy
and Ashley,
will discuss a peculiar story somehow related to the entertainment industry. This podcast might not change the world, but it just might satisfy your thirst for an intriguing tale.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, Ashley.
hello.
You know, I was driving in this morning and I was thinking, for us it's September 17th, but as I was noticing the surroundings, it is starting to look a little fallish.
I know, we took a little walk outside and the leaves were a little crunchy.
And you know, that's perfect because this will be coming out in October.
Yes.
And it also leads nicely into the question that I wanted to start with. So, you know, it's kind of one of those, I don't know, tropes, I guess. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but a common element in scary stories or even in childhood stories would be that creepy, scary neighborhood house. Do you have anything like that in your experience?
What do you think?
Well, I mean, you don't have to have gone into it. Like, is there one that was rumored to be haunted or some home that as you drove by, you would be like, ooh, I'm never going in there?
Yes, I think that there was. There's one in the town that I live in that was on the main street that was rumored to be haunted. And yes, I did go in there.
Oh,
once.
you went? What?
Well, because there was a person that we knew that lived there.
Oh, okay.
So we went in there just as a visit to them, and they said that it was, and that people never really lived there for very long.
Interesting.
I didn't feel anything when we were there, but apparently other people had.
Okay. And it makes a good story.
Sure.
Yeah. I was trying to think if I had any, and the only one that came to mind, I mean, I didn't ponder this, but I thought of the story I've already told you guys when we went
I was thinking of that.
Yes, when we went to Travis's house.
Foolishly.
Yes, it was fun. But I ask because I have a friend named Christy, and she and I were talking one day, and I was telling her about our October series and how we're focusing on local true crime. And she immediately said, well, you should do Murder Mansion.
Just the name alone.
I know. I'm like, Murder Mansion? What are you talking about? You know, let Christy share this with you.
Murder Mansion was a Bowling Green legend, especially for kids. I remember going to elementary school in Bowling Green and hearing kids talk about this mansion where supposedly bodies had been cut up in the shed. And you can imagine my surprise when I learned a little bit later on, probably 4th or 5th grade, that Murder Mansion actually sat at the front of our neighborhood. It was maybe 3 or 4 streets in the front of our neighborhood, and it really backed up to one of the side streets. And so we were the generation who roamed freely and did not come home, until the streetlights came on. And so we had a group of friends where we would get on our bikes and then we would ride up to the mansion. And I remember vividly like riding up there and sending friends up. I was never brave enough to, but I was always the one who would say, hey, why don't you go? And would send friends up to like run up to the door and ring the doorbell because we were fascinated by it. We wanted to actually see the shed. Like, where was the shed that all this took place, and who would actually live in a mansion where people had been murdered? What did those people look like? So we were fascinated by that, and so we would ride up to the mansion and see it. And I remember thinking that it was going to be this old, dilapidated, haunted house, but actually it was really this beautiful brick 2-story mansion with 4 columns, colonial columns. It was just a beautiful place. It was actually opposite of what you would expect. And so it's funny because even now as adults, anyone who grew up in Bowling Green knows the term, knows the house, Murder Mansion, and we will still talk about it as adults. I literally took my husband and children when I was showing them Bowling Green, my hometown, for the first time. I showed them the mansion, explained the story as I knew it. And when we were in Corvette Museum recently, I saw a book had been written about the true story, and I remember being mesmerized, even as an adult, adult, I picked up the book, I opened it up, I read the sleeve, I read the back, started reading as much as I could in the time that I had because I wanted to know the true story. Really, to this day, I only know the stories that we were told as children. So I am fascinated to find out the real story and really excited to hear this episode of the podcast, as I'm sure many people from Bowling Green will love to hear, because probably a lot of people have the same kind of picture or story in their mind just like I do, and it's exciting to hear the real thing.
That was Christy, my
That's
friend.
neat.
And I'm telling you, as I was talking with her in person, of course, she sent this audio in for us for
Yeah.
this episode. But when she was first telling me this, she had me hooked.
Yeah.
Because she's telling me about the murder mansion. She and her friends and her siblings going up and ding-dong ditching this house.
Yes.
And I'm hooked. Plus, she's talking about Bowling Green. I went to Western Kentucky University. So 100%, I am all in. I'm
Yeah.
like, this is it. We're going to do
We're
an
doing it.
episode.
We're doing it.
Yes, absolutely. So then I run across the very first article I see talks about this book that's been written by this man named Wes Swietek, who happens to be the managing editor for the Bowling Green Daily News. And it also gave more about the story, which was fascinating. So
Right.
many twists and turns. I showed it to you.
You did,
You
yes.
were equally fascinated.
Yes.
And Wes has agreed to do an interview
I
with
know.
us. So excited. I'm going to tell you that we both read the book. I know, speaking personally, as I read it, I was more hooked because I kept seeing he does such a beautiful job of giving context, and he's giving all this background on Bowling Green, and it turns out Western Kentucky University plays a role in it. So I am more and more hooked. And then we came across a connection to
I know.
Dark Highway.
I know.
I thought I was going to lose my mind.
You called me, you were so excited. And I was like, yes, this is super exciting.
Yes. So I cannot wait to tell you the story. What we're going to do is much in the same format that we used with Dark Highway. We're going to take this episode to tell you the story. This is based 100% on Wes's book, which is called The Cemetery Road Murders, The Shocking True Tale of Kentucky's Murder Mansion.
It was shocking too.
It was.
That's
It
an
was.
accurate word.
So we're going to tell you the story based on the book. And then next week, Wes will be here to talk about this whole story. And by the way, we're also going to hold back some information that Wes himself will share with you. But here's my recommendation. You have time. You have a week.
You absolutely do. I read this book in a day.
Yes,
I
it is.
did, but that's all I did that day. But I read it in a day.
Pause, go get the book, read it, because we're not going to do justice to the whole story. I mean, it is such a fascinating tale. He does such a wonderful job of telling it. We're going to hit the basic outline, the key points of this story, so that you can be with us next week when we talk with Wes. But 100% read this book. You're going to enjoy it.
Did you get it on Amazon?
I did.
Okay, there you go.
Yes.
Amazon.
And I bet you it's the book that Christy mentioned in her audio.
Oh,
When she
probably.
said she saw it at the Corvette Museum.
Probably.
I bet it's Wes's book. So one other surprise, Ashley.
Oh my.
My schedule has been very crazy lately.
It
I've had a
has.
hard time going anywhere, doing some things, but I managed to go to Bowling Green this
You
weekend.
did.
I did.
Oh, did you like tour the place?
What I
What did you
was
do?
by myself, managed to get a few hours, drove to Bowling Green,
Oh wow.
found the murder mansion.
Stop.
Saw it, saw the front of it, saw the back of it. We'll talk more about that later. Went into the cemetery. I was not able to find the exact tombstones I was looking for, but went and saw several key places. And
Ooh.
I
Did you get pictures?
I got some pictures.
Okay.
But it was both, how do I put this? It was double-edged because it was so nostalgic to be back on that campus and in
Yeah.
that area, having
Yeah.
gone there all those years ago, but then also to be looking for these specific places that Wes has
It's
detailed.
like a treasure hunt.
It was fascinating. It was wonderful. I loved every moment of it.
Good.
It was great.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm glad you got to do that.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the story.
All right.
All right. So we're going to actually start in the way that things first unraveled. Okay. On Wednesday, June 30th, 1948, at 5 a.m., a neighbor named J.F. Hunt, who also worked for the Pet Milk Company, stopped by the home of Dr. C.B. Martin and his wife, Martha. Now, that home, many people would call a mansion because it was very impressive.
I saw the photo in the book, and it is beautiful.
Gorgeous, gorgeous. But this is something that was a regular thing to do because the Martins sold milk produced by their cows to the Pet Milk Company, and they received a monthly check. So this was
Nice.
just kind of a pattern.
Yeah.
He would stop by once a month, drop off their check. But when J.F. Hunt didn't see anybody up and about, he was like, okay, well, and he just left the check on the Martins' back porch on top of the refrigerator. Around 6:30 a.m., 14-year-old Elsie Ray Hood came up to the Martins' house to get metal pails because he and his father, J.H. Hood, were going to milk the Martins' cows. The Hood family were tenant farmers. They actually lived on the Martins' property. The Martins hired them to help out, running the farm, getting the milk, all those things, so that they lived there. Well, when he got there, Elsie noticed something a little odd. The pail that Martha, the wife, always used to get milk from her favorite cow was still sitting there, and he could tell it hadn't been used. That wasn't normal. Mrs. Mart is what they called Martha. Mrs. Mart usually got up at daybreak. This 14-year-old boy, Elsie, registers, this is kind of a little unusual. No big deal, though. Just about that same time, Elsie's 11-year-old twin sisters show up. Their dad had sent them up saying, hey, that check from the pet milk company should have come in. Go get our part of it, because they got a little, a little piece of the money every time that payment came. The twins are there too, but they're not seeing the Martins up, so they end up leaving without getting the money. So around 7 a.m., a painter shows up. This is a painter that the Martins had hired to spruce up some of the rooms in the home. His name was Joe Emerson. He's ready to get working. And when he gets there, he goes on into the house through the back door. He goes into the kitchen. He gets a key to the smokehouse because that's where all of his paint supplies are. He did call out to the Martins, but they didn't answer. So he just went about his business, went on out to the smokehouse, and he noticed, oh, hey, Mr. Martin, Dr. Martin said he was going to get me a can of white paint that I needed, but it's not there. So he goes back to the house because he's going to find out what the deal is with that paint. On the way, he runs into J.H. Hood. That's the dad. He's coming up to find this money for himself. He needs his payment. Now these two men are coming up to the house. You jump in here because I know you've read the book too, but the way it read to me, it sounded like maybe J.H. kind of waited on the back porch or in the kitchen area, because it sounded as though Joe walked through the home himself. He did enter through the back door again, moved into the kitchen, and then when he, didn't really see anybody and he also nothing looked wrong, he decided to keep on going up through the house. So then he moves from the kitchen down this long hallway, goes past the parlor, goes past the sitting room. The painter, Joe, noticed that Dr. Martin had laid out his work clothes on the front stairs the way he always did, and then he looked over at the room located on his right, which was the Martins' bedroom.
This is very interesting to me because I don't recall in older homes the bedroom being right next to the front door.
I have seen it once or twice.
Really?
And because I remember it struck me as odd then too. I think you're right. Usually you would see like a parlor or something so you could entertain the company before you would get back to your bedroom.
And maybe that was the original use for the room and they turned it into a bedroom. It struck me as your bedroom's right off the front door.
Right.
Interesting.
But then I wondered, this is a very wealthy, well-to-do, smart man, and I'm sure his wife was equally smart. I wonder if it was almost a thing of we're kind of in control of our house. Like, let's put ourselves up here at the front.
Maybe.
And, I don't know.
But also, it sounds like most people come to the back door.
That's a good
point. So
point.
it could be swapped, where really what we would consider the front of the house is the back of the house to them. So it's furthest away from the traffic.
That's a good point. I like that. So again, he looks over. There's the Martins' bedroom, and he notices the door is open. So obviously he can look right in. And when he does, it's very dim because the window shades were closed. But when his eyes adjusted, he saw Dr. Martin was lying on the floor beside the bed on his back with his knees drawn up. And then he saw that Martha was laying face down on the bed. So of course he looks closer, and that's when he noticed that they are covered with blood. And not just them, but there is blood on the bed, the floor, the wall.
Everywhere.
He made himself, I'm just imagining how horrified he was, but he made himself check for a pulse from both Charles and Martha. By the way, I'm just going to go ahead and say this up front. Charles was often called CB, and he was a doctor, so they either called him Doctor or CB. I'm going to call him CB, just for sake of continuity. But he noticed that they were both stiff and cold to the touch. There was no pulse. So Joe quickly left the room, and he went back to tell J.H. Hood that the Martins had been killed. And J.H. Hood later admitted that he was afraid the killer might still be there, so he ended up running on out through through the front door and over to the road where he came across another neighbor, Herschel Bright. So then those two men came back into the house where Joe is now using the Martins' phone to call the police. This has all happened very quickly.
Very quickly.
Right. It's only just a few minutes after 7 a.m. at this point. Now, the police come, and one of the first things they notice is that Dr. Martin was holding in his right hand a bloody dark blue ribbon that looks similar to something that you would see in a hat at that time, a fedora. So it looked like a hat band. They also obviously noticed how grisly the scene was. In fact, based on the lacerations on Dr. Martin's forehead and how bloody the scene was, police at first mistakenly thought they had been attacked with an axe.
Ugh.
Yeah, and some of the papers even took that to press because they had to publish before all the facts came out.
Yeah.
And so it was actually reported that way by some newspapers.
That was fast.
I know. Coroner Chester Basham and a local doctor, John Black, did an examination at the scene, and then the Martins' bodies were taken to a local funeral home for autopsies, and that is when they realized that the Martins had actually been murdered by gunshot. Dr. Martin had been shot 3 times in his left cheek, through the right side of his neck, below the ear, and through his right temple, and it looked as though the temple shot had been inflicted at close range based on the powder burns. He also had a few scratches on his body and contusions and abrasions on his head. Martha had been shot only once through the back of her head. Because full rigor mortis had set in, the time of death was estimated as occurring between 1 and 2 a.m. And then, as they were going through the house looking for other clues, the police noticed a few other things I'll mention. They saw what appeared to be sand in the bed where Martha had been laying, and also small pieces of broken glass on the floor near Dr. Martin's body where it had been, and they sent that to the lab for analysis. They also noticed the latch to the front door was broken, which indicated to them forced entry. There was also a bullet hole in the front door, but not in the screen door, which led the police to believe the screen door was open when the shot was fired. And they did find a bullet lodged in the baseboard, where they were able to pull out this .32 caliber bullet out of the wood. Okay. Now, although there were no neighbors who lived really close by, some neighbors did report hearing some odd things. One woman later told reporters that she was wakened around 1:30 a.m. by what sounded like a woman shouting. One farmer said he heard a dog bark around 1 a.m. and then the sound of a car starting. And another neighbor was driving on Cemetery Road a little after 1 a.m. and said he saw a sedan parked in a field near the Martin house. And he said, quote, "The lights were out, and as I passed, I caught a glimpse of a figure on the front seat, but I can't be sure if there was anybody else in the car. I remember thinking some young couple was spooning," because it was kind of a lover's lane area. Yeah. So that 14-year-old boy, Elsie Ray Hood, that we've already mentioned, he remembered, once he was questioned, hearing what sounded like a woman's scream late in the night or early in the morning. And while no one remembered hearing gunshots, they made the note that all of this testimony did seem to fit that estimated time of death.
Which really wasn't that far past when they were found. If you think 2 a.m. and people started showing up at the house about 4 hours later, that's not a lot of time.
No, it's not. That's true. So in searching the property, the police found only one shell, a .32 caliber one, near the front door, which led them to assume that the killer had found and taken the other shells from the bedroom with him or her, but maybe had forgotten about the one that was fired outside the front door, or else couldn't find it, one or the other. This is how they interpreted the clues in the bedroom. They thought the ribbon in Dr. Martin's hand was likely because he had pulled it off his attacker's hat band during a struggle.
That's a good thought.
The glass was likely also due to the struggle, probably the attacker's broken watch. The sand in the bed led the investigators to think maybe the perpetrator was a seasoned criminal, because at that time it was really common for burglars to use a sand-filled bag as a tool or a weapon. Like they would hit you with it to knock you out.
A blunt force weapon.
But while burglary was an immediate theory, because this was a wealthy family, that didn't really seem to fit. Because first of all, Dr. Martin's brother told the police that CB often did his business by check, and the milk check was still there. The house had not been ransacked. The killer hadn't taken Martha's gold ring from her hand or Dr. Martin's watch from the top of the dresser. So they were like, this doesn't really really seem to fit. What else could be a motive? Okay. Another mystery was why somebody would have shot through the front door before breaking in.
Right.
So there were just things that weren't making sense. And then just by happenstance, as they were later interviewing witnesses and different people, Warren County Sheriff J. Bodley Davenport happened to remember somebody had said to him in passing, you know, there's a boy mighty worked up over Stonewall Martin and Ruth McKinney getting married, because just recently, the Martins' only son, 52-year-old Stonewall Martin Jackson, or Stoney, as they called him, had recently gotten married to a girl who was either 18 or 19 at the time, named Ruth McKinney. Now, Stoney lived with the Martins in their mansion, and he helped to manage his parents' properties, but he wasn't home during this time. According to Wes in his book, quote, he was described as being kindly but a bit of a recluse, as well as a hunchback, a reference to the curvature of his spine from an illness at a young age. Stoney was actually still away on his honeymoon at this time. So the sheriff went to question Ruth's father, asking if he knew of any men who might be upset about Ruth's marriage to Stoney. Turns out he did. In fact, do you remember
like 17?
Yes!
It was 17. I was like, Ruth!
I know.
My goodness.
So, yeah, he gives a list of 17 men who could be connected to Ruth in some way. They started tracking them down. They're starting to clear the men, you know, who had great alibis, until finally they were left with one guy, Harry Edward Kilgore. And regarding this Kilgore fella, who went by his middle name, which was Edward, Ruth's dad told the sheriff that Edward had dated Ruth very recently for a time. I think it was a few months. And in fact, just in the past few days, Edward had stopped by the McKinney house a few times to see if Ruth and Stoney were back from their honeymoon yet. And one of those times when he was visiting, he happened to look over, because the McKinneys were neighbors to the Martins. So he happened to look over, and across the way he saw lights on at the Martin house, and just happened to comment that maybe the newlyweds might have had an accident and had to come home early. And at the time, of course, that comment seemed pretty odd to the father, but it didn't raise any alarms. Now it did. Now it did. And the investigators decided it might be a good idea to go check out Edward Kilgore.
The other shocking thing to me was when the crime took place to the catching of the criminal, it has to be some kind of record. I was just like, wait, this happened by 11? You got your guy? Like, these guys, this is an amazing police force.
Pretty crazy how this worked out. Because they immediately go try to find Edward. Well, he's not at his rooming house. So I think it was the landlady who said, you know what, check his mom's house in Glasgow, because Edward spends a lot of time there. So they go to Glasgow. His mother, Ella, said Edward wasn't there and she didn't know where he was. But just then, the officers happened to notice
he's sneaking out the back.
He's pulling out of the driveway at the side of the house.
Oh, that one. I didn't. That Edward. I'm sorry. I thought you meant my other son. Also named Edward.
Well, shockingly, they decided to stop Edward and question him. And in the car that he was driving, they found 2 flashlights, one with a dent and what looked like dried blood and matted hair on it. They also noticed that some of the glass from the flashlight's lens was missing. Also discovered in the car, skeleton keys, a knife.
I thought you were going to say a skeleton. I was like, what? I missed that part. Sorry.
A woman's purse, boots, a thermos top, wire, and 4 .32 caliber shells. When asked where he had been the night before, Edward said he had hung out all evening with a friend, a music professor from Western, and he had left at dawn to drive to Glasgow. So they took Edward in for questioning, but he refused to speak until a very renowned and skilled attorney named William H. Natcher kind of had an intuition. He was like, I'm going to get this guy alone. I'm going to try to build some rapport. He gets Edward alone, and almost immediately he asks Edward what happened, and Edward says, Mr. Natcher, I killed Dr. and Mrs. Martin, and went on to sign a detailed confession outlining what happened.
Yeah, isn't it like before noon?
It was crazy how fast it was.
That's wow.
So it's funny because you're reading the book and you're like, wow, okay, this is kind of cut and dried.
No, it's not.
Boy, were we wrong.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to pause there now and we're going to fill in some of the backstory. Okay, we're going to catch you up. Harry Edward Kilgore was born in 1923 in Glasgow, and his family was pretty prominent because his grandfather was a druggist who for a time owned a local newspaper. Now, when Edward was only 2, his father, Reed Kilgore, hanged himself at their family home.
That was sad.
I know, it was so sad. His dad had been a highly respected, dependable mail carrier who delivered the mail using this really rigged up horse-drawn buggy thing that he had put together himself. He'd modified himself. But just a few days after Edward was born, a car had crashed into that mail buggy while Reed was in it. And at first it didn't seem like Reed was very badly hurt, but many reports said that over time his health had gradually declined to the point that he finally had to resign from his job. And it is theorized that these factors led to his depression and then ultimately led him to take his life in June of 1925. Edward's mom, Ella, married another man, but that relationship didn't last very long. So for most of his childhood, it was Edward, his mother, and his sister, who was also named Ella and was 10 years older. So we have two Ellas. Okay. Edward attended Glasgow schools. He had what seemed to be a fairly normal childhood, considering, he played the baseball with his friends on the weekends in elementary school. He was involved in some activities, but Wes mentioned in the book that there were some signs that he was affected by his dad's passing and some of the things that had happened to him. In fact, one of the comments from Wes was this. Actually, it's referring to this small hill close to Edward's house. It was here, in the heart of the Glasgow City Cemetery, his grandfather had helped establish that he would come at night, sit at the grave of Reed Kilgore, and try to communicate with the father he never really knew.
That's sad.
Yeah, and that was a thing. They would talk through his whole life about him wandering through cemeteries and graveyards. So Edward grew up to be lanky, about 6 feet tall, 150 pounds, with blue eyes. Some of the terms used to describe him in the book were wistful-eyed, brilliant, moody, and eccentric. After high school graduation in 1941, he went to LA for a short time, but was actually back in Glasgow by 1942. During that time he was in LA, however, he later said, quote, "I recall walking the streets and I was just walking along in the bright daylight and the high buildings around me and people everywhere. And sometimes I seemed to have a tendency to want to destroy a person. No particular person. It was a vague feeling and a far away and something that just walks along the side of you. And that was the first time I was conscious of that."
That's a little spooky there, bud.
Yeah. So he enlisted in the United States Naval Reserve when he was 19, but was discharged after just 5 months with no specific reason given. But there was a reference to a Bureau of Naval Personnel directive that deals with, quote, psychiatric and neurological handicaps, and he was not recommended for reenlistment. Wes noted that latter part of the phrase, the neurological handicaps, was sometimes a euphemism during that time period that was used for being gay. So that's just a wondering. He just noted that. Okay. Next, Edward worked in the Curtiss Wright factory in Louisville, helping to build military cargo planes until he lost his job in 1945 due to the wartime production slowing down. In September of 1945, Edward enrolled in Western Kentucky State Teachers College in Bowling Green to study physics with a minor in mathematics. Little side note, it started as this Western Kentucky State Teachers College, and it had probably 12 or 1,400 students at this time. But this is what would later turn into Western Kentucky University.
Which is where you went.
Yes, which has like 20,000 plus students. But at Western, Edward worked for a while as an assistant physics laboratory instructor, and he joined the Western Players Theater Group. And we know he continued to wander cemeteries because there are actual Bowling Green police records that mention catching him in a cemetery and having to run him off. And it was also while at Western that Edward, according to his own later reflection, and he admitted that he suffered a lot of rejection from girls over the years. But in 1947, when he was a junior, a girl named Lena McKinney agreed to go on a date with him. He planned to take her to a friend's party and later discovered Lena didn't actually come just because Edward had asked her on this date. She was interested in somebody at the party. So she brought her younger sister Ruth with her as a distraction, and it worked because they hit it off. Edward and Ruth actually started dating. Wes described Ruth as a pretty dark-haired 18-year-old freshman at Western who had no shortage of suitors.
Apparently, 17.
Right? Yeah. Her family, the McKinneys, were a farm family who, as we've already said, lived just down the road from the Martins. Let's reiterate this again. The Martin home is this massive, impressive, wealthy home. It's a large brick colonial-style home built in the mid-1800s that the Martins had owned since 1918. And when they bought it, over the years, they had upgraded it quite a bit. They added a wing to the front of the house. They also added 8 huge Greek columns and a balcony. So this was a very impressive home. And they're like the only one in this area that's like that. I mean, all the other homes are pretty modest, you know. And the Martins are not just wealthy, they are business savvy. CB had practiced medicine. He was a doctor who had retired from that work to now become a gentleman farmer who also owned a lot of property. He had bought up a lot of land in the local area, but also in other places like Oklahoma, where the land he owned there had great potential for having oil on it.
That's even more money.
Yeah, like they owned a lot of valuable stuff. They had something like 325 acres at this point and had so much farmland that, as we've already mentioned, they had to hire tenant farmers to help take care of the animals in the fields on their property in Bowling Green. Again, their only son, Stoney, also lived with them and helped out with managing the properties. Edward and Ruth over here dated a short time. A Courier Journal article said it was about 6 months, and then it ended. And then in 1948, 52-year-old Stoney Martin announced he was marrying young Ruth McKinney.
That really had to come out of nowhere.
Right? Well, it turns out, you know, again, as their neighbors on Cemetery Road, Stoney would often drive past Ruth as she was walking to and from Western, and he would offer her rides, and she accepted, and before you know it, they had a relationship. So they were married June 23rd of 1948 in Russellville, Kentucky, where they had some extended family, and reportedly CB and Martha were thrilled because they had worried that he might never
Be a bachelor.
Yeah, that he might never find a partner. So after the wedding, the new couple headed off on their honeymoon, which involved visiting some of the properties in Oklahoma and family in Arkansas. Meanwhile, the Martins hired a painter to freshen up some of the rooms in their house because the plan was that
For them to live there.
would live with them. And while on their honeymoon is when they got the call that Stoney's parents had been brutally murdered, which brings us back to where we left off.
All right.
We have Edward confessing that he did it. So in his confession, I'm going to summarize. Again, read the book. There's so much interesting detail.
You're doing a good job of summarizing this, by the way.
Thank you.
Because I know how convoluted this story is.
It's so interesting. There's
Yeah.
so many twists and turns. But here's just a brief overview of the confession. He said the pistol came into his possession while he was working at Curtis Wright in Louisville, and that the car he drove the night of the murders was an Oldsmobile owned by his sister. The confession said that because the dog was out front, he chose to enter the house by a side door in the back. The screen was hooked, so he used a wire to punch a hole and push the lock up, and that as he came into the house, it was so dark that he had to wander around a bit, and he kind of saw some light ahead of him, and he just followed the light, which took him towards the front door, and he went ahead and stepped out onto the front porch, at which point Dr. Martin unexpectedly ran up behind him and slammed the front door, which, according to Edward, panicked him, and as he lunged across, the gun went off. So he runs back inside and into the room where Mrs. Martin was, and he realized that it was the Martins' bedroom and that both CB and Martha were in there. Edward wrote that he was scared. He then told of taking out a piece of ribbon that he had, thinking that he was going to use that to tie them up. Well, Mrs. Martin, Martha, followed his orders to lay still on the bed, but Dr. Martin started fighting back. And in the confession, here's what Edward said happened next. Quote, I wanted to tie him up in the scuffle, but he started yelling, so my mind just left me. I remember shooting, and I shot a lot. Mrs. Martin was on the bed when I was shooting. I was scuffling with him on the bed, and I shoved him on the bed and shot at him. All of a sudden, I realized what I had done. I ran out the back door and went around to the back door and went out directly to the car across the fence. I ran to the car and backed it out from the tree in the field to the cemetery road and left. So according to Edward, it was after midnight when he killed Dr. Martin and his wife, and upon leaving, he drove to a bridge and threw the gun into the river. He also tossed into the river a bag of sand that he said he had brought with him to hit the to hit the Martins in the head, because he wrote that he did not want to hurt them. He had not intended to hurt them. The confession also mentioned he had taken a flashlight with him into the house. And a significant sentence in the confession was where Edward wrote, quote, I had been so disappointed all all my life with relations with girls, because this is going to come back. Him talking about it being such an issue, how he'd been rejected so much by girls. In fact, this leads him to explain his motivation for even going into the Martin house. According to him, it was because he was upset over Ruth's marriage to Stoney, and because he missed her that he even went in there. Okay? All of the evidence matched the confession. I mean, the police are thinking this is
We
great.
got it. This is
yeah,
great.
I mean, you've got the shell casings that match the one they found. The footprints around the Martin house matched the overshoes that Edward wore. His fingerprints were found on the hat band that was clutched in Dr. Martin's hand. I mean, even all of the reported sounds and things that the neighbors had heard matched. You know, you had the
Right.
dog barking, the woman shouting, the person seen in a parked car near the Martin home. It's all there. So they're like, we have this thing wrapped
Like
up.
you said, cut and dry.
Yes. And this is also very sensational, by the way, because, I mean, this is so unexpected and it's so brutal and terrible. And so headlines across the region about what has happened. And then the defense threw a wrench in the works by saying they were going to go for the insanity plea, which meant that they hoped Edward would be found not guilty by reason of insanity.
Diminished capacity.
Here's where I got really excited again, because they suddenly mentioned that Rhodes Kirby Myers
Yep.
was hired by Edward's mom, Ella, to lead the defense team. Do you guys remember that name?
I do.
Yes. That's the same lawyer who was on Henry Denhart's defense team. He is the guy. Remember, we talked about this, by the way, last September when we did our original series on In Our Own Backyard, the whole Dark Highway murder case,
Right.
where Henry Denhart was charged with murdering Verna Garr Taylor. Rhodes Myers was the man who was with Henry in the street when the Garr brothers came, and Henry ended up getting gunned down in the
Yep.
middle of the road by Roy Garr.
And he said, "Don't shoot, I'm only the lawyer."
Yes, and they made fun of him, and all, they made a song about it,
Oh.
which he was not thrilled about, by
I
the
don't-
way.
yeah, I can see that.
But so Wes shares in his book that Rhodes Myers ended up getting a lot of publicity, not only for his involvement with Henry's case, but also for his role in the subsequent trial against Roy Garr, which leads to his career taking off. He was elected lieutenant governor from 1939 to 43. Then he ran for governor, but he didn't get that one. So basically, at the time of Edward Kilgore's trial, he's a
big
big
stuff.
Yes, he is very well respected, and he is in fact a state senator. So in his attempt to go for this insanity defense, Rhodes Myers petitioned the judge to get a psychiatric examination of Edward, which was granted.
Yeah.
Again, lots of interesting detail in the book. You should go read it, but I'm going to give you the short version. He was evaluated by 3 local doctors at the jail and a team of 7 very prestigious doctors associated with Vanderbilt later, and that team wrote this 5-page report. Fascinating. But a few of the points that they made were that he'd always had issues with women, he did not seem to recognize the gravity of his situation, and that some of the things that he shared, including some of the actions he took during the Martin murders, seemed to be illogical or even silly. And so they wrote the opinion that he did not seem to possess sufficient mind and mental capacity to know the difference between right and wrong or to realize the consequences of his acts. In other words, they're saying, yup, go for the insanity defense.
Yep,
we
yep.
support you.
Yep.
We're kind of in hold for just a bit because they're waiting for the arraignment. Ruth and Stoney finally arrived back in Bowling Green, and actually during this interim period, the funeral for the Martins is held. And then at the arraignment, Edward did enter, as expected, the plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. So now they have to wait for the grand jury hearing. And this is when Edward would sometimes be seen in his cell with his hair crazy, his beard grown out. He might be wandering around the space, dragging a broom in one hand. And popular opinion was that this was all dramatics.
Well, yeah, of course. That's when I was reading it. I thought, and you just told us he was in a play. This is acting.
Yeah. Another attorney later commented, quote, Rhodes Myers had told Kilgore how to act, what to do, and he never said a word, let his hair grow, and didn't talk. So when the grand jury met in September, Rhodes Myers asked the court to bar any other legal proceedings against his client pending a determination of his sanity, and the judge agreed. So basically they're saying, if he's insane, you know, we're not worrying about this, right? It's all going to hinge on whether or not he's determined to be sane or not.
Right.
So the prosecution realizes their only chance to counter this is with an even more renowned expert, and they bring in this very, very expensive guy named Manfred Schanfarber Gutmacher, who is like the fella who trains everybody else.
By name alone, you can tell.
Yes. At the sanity hearing on the 22nd of September 1948, it's up to this group of 12 jurors to decide basically whether or not Edward Kilgore is going to face a murder trial. He shows up with long, uncombed hair, messy beard. While the lawyers would be interviewing potential jurors or going into the proceedings, he would show no interest. Sometimes he would work on physics problems.
I
or
like
hold
the part where he holds his book upside down. Like, that's too far. You've gone too far.
Right.
Now we know.
It's over the top, over the top. He might flip through a comic book. He would wear the same clothes every day. It was so
Ridiculous.
Dramatic. Yes. Stoney and Ruth were there, but they stayed very calm. They didn't speak to reporters. And similar to what happened with the Dark Highway case, the courtroom was packed. People would skip lunch because they were afraid if they got up, they'd lose their seats.
Yeah.
It was so sensational. One of the notable witnesses who testified was Edward's mom, Ella. When she was questioned, she was 100% supporting this insanity defense.
Of course she was.
Oh, yeah. She spoke of the family's long history of mental illness. She said that Edward's father's death by suicide was due to mental rather than health issues, and actually said that Edward had an unsound mind and that he'd always been different. She even called him very crazy at one point.
Thanks, Mom.
I know.
I know you're trying to help, but thanks, Mom.
All these different people came in and would talk about his unusual behaviors, like wearing odd clothes, wandering through the graveyard. One time during a storm, supposedly he had been barking at the lightning while holding his hands up towards the sky. They brought in letters and doodles. One letter to a female friend included this comment: "I have almost an irresistible impulse to hold you close to my breast and feel your warm blood oozing over my body."
Too much.
On the flip side, you had policemen, the ones who had arrested him, saying he acted very normal. And of course, the big move was putting Dr. Guttmacher on the stand, who basically said he's putting on a great act. Okay. The prosecution also called in more doctors to testify. Everybody agreed, all of their witnesses, that Edward was sane. And it only took the jurors about 2.5 hours to come back with their decision that Edward Kilgore was mentally fit to stand trial. So his trial was set for mid-September of the following year. And this time he came in looking very neat and clean-shaven.
He's
and
like,
wearing fresh
okay,
clothes.
fine.
Again, the courtroom is packed. They had 24 jurors instead of 12 because they were going to hold one trial, but they were going to have two different juries decide basically, the sentencing and different questions regarding Dr. C.B. Martin versus Martha Martin. And the death penalty was on the table. But instead of starting the trial, something very unexpected happened. Rhodes Myers asked the judge for a recess so that he and Edward could meet with one of the lead prosecutors, Top Orendorff. The judge agreed, and in that private meeting, Orendorff was shocked to find out that Edward wanted to make a plea deal. And this is where Edward says that he was not actually alone doing those murders the way he had said in his confession. There was an accomplice to the murders, a very good friend that he had been trying to protect. But if the prosecution would agree to spare him the death penalty, he would plead guilty, accept life in prison, and tell the true story of what had really happened that night.
And this is where we hear dun dun dun.
I know.
You're like, what?
And they checked with Stoney Martin, and the prosecutor agreed. And then, because the juries legally had to set the sentence, it was basically a formality, but each jury sentenced him to a life in prison, which meant that he received 2 life terms. And this is where a new person enters this entire narrative, George Daggett, who Edward now claims was not only the mastermind behind the murders, but the one who actually committed them. And this is where we're going to take a break.
I knew it. I could tell. We are so thankful for all the support our listeners have given us over the years. Whether rating and reviewing, sharing, or sending in your shoutouts and suggestions, we truly would not be here without you. We're also so appreciative of your financial support over on Buy Me a Coffee. Through your memberships, we're able to keep the lights on and the tea brewing. Speaking of, we've been brewing up our Patreon account in the background over our summer break, and we're thrilled to say it's finally launched. All of our minisodes are loaded and ready, along with our other perks. If you have a Patreon account, consider adding Scandal Water to your list of support. We'll be sure to raise our glass to you in thanks. Cheers!
And we are back. Oh my goodness, this story.
I know.
I was like, I felt like we got to this part and I'm like, we're like starting a whole new story.
I know.
This is so so crazy. Okay, so George Melvin Daggett was a music professor who taught at Western Kentucky State Teachers College, and he had met Edward in 1946 in a music class at the college. So around this time, he would have been maybe 35, and he lived in a small apartment with his mother, who had some very serious health issues.
Yeah, she did.
Yeah. She was diabetic, and just a few years before she'd had to have her foot amputated. So it fell to George to not just kind of help take care of her, but also to support her financially, because she had some very big medical bills
Yeah, she did.
and she couldn't work. So it was basically on him. Now, George was a talented musician with a very impressive educational background. It included a whole list of schools, but one of those was Juilliard, and his resume included a lot of things as well, but I'll give you a couple. He was a director of the Flatbush Boys Club Glee Club, and he taught piano lessons and had worked as a music therapist in a psychiatric facility. And in fact, it was his background with that psychiatric facility that reportedly helped Edward and George form such a close relationship. So George, according to Edward, quote, had experience with mental patients, and he goes on to say that George recognized Edward as a, quote, mental case. This is Edward's words here. So George would play soothing music for Edward when he was struggling, or otherwise, he would use that music and his friendship to help Edward, who seemed to be having a lot of difficulties, to the point where Edward said they had grown to become soulmates. He would say, I loved him. George eventually grew closer to Edward than his own mother was to him, Edward said. And the two would often spend time together at George's music studio at Western or at Edward's family home in Glasgow. And it was through those visits to Edward's family home that George also came to know Edward's mom, Ella, and his sister, also Ella. So
he's a member of the family.
Yes. So after making this plea agreement, Edward's testimony had to be presented to a grand jury, along with other witness testimony and evidence, of course, to see if they felt there was enough there to indict George Daggett. And it turned out they did. George was indicted for being an accessory before the fact to the willful murder of the Martins, and here's a new thing, also for blackmailing a violin teacher at Western. George was arrested the same day and taken to the Warren County Jail.
Because they believe in fast justice there. It's
do.
just like, what?
They do. To briefly summarize, here is what Edward accused George of. First, we'll talk about the extortion scheme. This is now his version, right?
Yeah.
Edward says that the need for money was a huge driving factor for George. In fact, earlier that same year, George had actually borrowed money, about $2,500, from Edward's mom, Ella. For perspective, George's annual salary was only $3,200.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. According to Edward, George's need for money, and specifically he really felt pressured to pay back this loan he had taken from Ella, is what led George and Edward to blackmail a woman named Olga Eitner, who, I don't know how you read this in the book, but to me it sounded like they were friends, like they socialized together.
It sounded like it, yeah, and that's why they picked her if this did happen.
Right, yes, because this is all kind of alleged, I guess. But to briefly summarize, at this time, Olga was a single attractive musician in her early 40s, and the story was that somehow Edward and George had either arranged for Olga to rendezvous with a traveling shoe salesman, or maybe they just knew that she had an encounter planned with this fella.
Yeah.
But one way or the other, they burst, well, I think it sounded like it was Edward, burst into Olga's apartment.
I don't think George was there. I think it was just Edward.
While the two were together, and managed to get a picture of the couple in a compromising position. Sometimes it said photo, sometimes it said photo, so I'm not sure if it was one or more. But George and Edward then threatened to release the photo or photos to the higher-ups at Western if Olga did not give them money and also her car. So reportedly, she ended up paying them $4,600 and also transferring ownership of her Oldsmobile to Edward, who then transferred ownership of that car to his sister. And that's the one he was driving that day, right?
Yeah.
And I will say this, at some point in the book, I remember Wes noted that the lawmen, the attorneys, said that George did admit to this extortion scheme.
Oh, really? Okay. I missed that part.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, now, regarding the Martin murders, here is a brief overview of how Edward now says it happened, okay? First, he claimed that the confession he had signed before was written for him. It wasn't true. He said, quote, I just signed it after it was typed. Okay, so basically they wrote it, he signed it, okay? That's his new story. Now, the true story was, again, money being this huge motivation for George in general, he says it was also the motivation behind the murder of the Martins. Edward said that they came up with the idea that they were first going to murder CB and Martha, and then later they would take out Stoney, which would leave Ruth open for Edward to marry, and then Edward and George could both share in the Martin property and fortune. Okay, so on the night of the murders, Edward now says that George went to the front of the house and Edward went to the back door. Edward used the coat hanger to unlatch the screen door and wandered through the house a bit until he went up the hall and got to the front door, and when he stepped outside, it slammed behind him. Of course, that startled him, and when he whirled around, he accidentally fired a wild shot through the door, and then he broke down that door, and that's when both George and Edward rushed into the bedroom, where Dr. Martin started yelling and fighting. Edward said that he used the flashlight to beat Dr. Martin unconscious while Martha stayed in the bed as they told her to. Although he had told the lawyers when he was making the plea deal that George was actually the one who had murdered the Martins, now to the grand jury, Edward is saying that it was Edward who had actually shot them.
So he's changing it again.
He changed the story again, yes. He goes on to say that after the murders, he dropped George off at his apartment and then drove to his family's home in Glasgow. And rather than throw the gun in the river, which was his original story, that was what he had said in the confession, this time he says he took the gun, flashlight, tools, and other items with him. He said his mother found the gun wrapped up in one of his sweaters and asked Edward's uncle to get rid of it. By the way, that gun was never found. The story would later be told by Edward's uncle that it was stolen. Okay, that's basically the key points of the new version. So now we have that version of what Edward said happened. This is what he had told the grand jury. That's now documented, right? And we're moving into George's trial. It took place in January of 1950 in front of another packed courtroom. Paul Huddleston served as George's defense lawyer, and as expected, George pled not guilty. Edward, of course, was brought in to testify, and what Edward would end up sharing about his activities with George, according to Wes in the book, quote, would provide what observers at the time called the most lurid, bizarre, and sensational testimony ever heard in a Kentucky courtroom.
That's amazing.
I know. Now here's what Edward testified this time.
A news story. He's also a writer.
Yeah. Very imaginative. So he says that they had been planning the murders for a while. In this version, he said that George had even used binoculars sometimes so that they could spy on the Martin house and try to figure out details like where the Martins' bedroom was located and what time they went to sleep. This particular night, the night of the murders, as they were driving along Cemetery Road, George suddenly declared, this is it. This is the night. We're going to do it. So Edward said that...
all that planning. And then they're like, you know what? Spur of the moment. This is it. This is it. No.
Waiting for the right time. Waiting for the right time. So anyway, Edward said he went around back and almost stepped on the dog who was sleeping. He went around front and told George to wait by the front door and that he was going to come through from the back. So then Edward went back to the back porch, used a piece of wire to open the latch, and came through the house with the gun in one hand and flashlight in the other. But George wasn't at the front door when he reached it, and so Edward stepped outside. Suddenly, Dr. Martin slammed the door behind him, and the gun accidentally went off when Edward whirled around. George then rushed up, and the two broke open the door and rushed into the bedroom. Edward tried to tie up the doctor, who broke free and was fighting, so this time he said it was George who beat him with the flashlight and sand-filled sock. Then they both tied Dr. Martin and Martha up, but the doctor got free and started yelling, and that's when George, according to Edward, said, shoot them and let's get out of here. And Edward admitted that he did. Before they left the room, they untied the hands of CB and Martha, although apparently they left behind the ribbon that Dr. Martin still had in his hand, and Edward said he stuck a knife in Dr. Martin's head. Finally, he dropped off George at his apartment before driving to Glasgow. This time he said the gun was one that George had helped him steal, and George had even shown him how to use it. Now, Edward did stick to what he had told the grand jury in terms of their motivation. He said they planned to kill the Martins and then later Stoney so that Edward could marry Ruth, and then the three of them would live together in the Martin mansion and they'd be wealthy and happy. And he also did say that he loved Ruth. But he shocked the courtroom when he said he had told Ruth about their plans to kill the Martins, but he said she had not taken him seriously. He also firmly stated she had no role in the murders and had not promised to marry him if this occurred. So he basically said she knew about it, but she hadn't been in on any of this. Okay. Now, the fact that Edward called George his soulmate and at one point said, quote, "I loved him," increased his sensationalism.
Right.
People were obviously speculating as to whether their relationship was romantic.
Right.
Okay. Now, one of the things that George's attorney, Paul Huddleston, was able to get Edward to discuss on stand was his fantasies about killing women or a woman. And this, of course, is also incredibly shocking. So according to his testimony, we've already mentioned this, we've alluded to it before, but it seemed to have first started when he was in California. He said he now thought of it often. One of the fantasies, this is disturbing, but one of the fantasies being to chop up their bodies and feed them to the hogs. And then here's part of a different statement that he made related to this idea. Quote, "I know that there have been times when I was considerably moved to bring some peculiar feeling out of myself by destroying girls. I wanted to see them dead like statues up in the cemetery that stand up on the monument." Another dramatic moment was when George's attorney, Paul Huddleston, suddenly asked Edward, "What was the name of the man you killed in Los Angeles?" Prosecutor objected, of course, and it was sustained. But Huddleston then said simply, "Have you killed a man in Los Angeles?" And Edward said no, but it was in everybody's mind now. Yeah, what is this about? Did he murder somebody in LA?
I can imagine that audience was just clutching their pearls the whole time.
I know. Oh my gosh. So Edward claimed that he and George had actually talked through plans to kill something like 8 different people. And usually it was if it was people who had angered them, or if they could get something out of it, like financial gain, or if there was something that would benefit them. Now, I'm just going to mention this because it came up a few times. We have so many connections to previous episodes.
We do.
I know. So it was interesting that Paul Huddleston also asked Edward about reading the Edgar Allan Poe short story, The Cask of Amontillado, while he was in jail.
And y'all know how I feel about that.
And Edward agreed that he had. So the story is about this man who walls up his drunken, unsuspecting friend after he believes that friend had insulted him. And so the defense...
Because he just took it from insult to just walling him in. That escalated the situation.
Yeah, I'm gonna bury you alive. Yeah.
That's what you get.
So the defense attorney would later argue that Edward had the same motivation for accusing George of being an accomplice. Basically, he wanted to get back at a friend who had done him wrong, because what they are going to say later is that George, after Edward's arrest, really offended Edward or hurt him because he didn't seem to support Edward enough. He also stopped sending money to the mom and the sister, the Ellas, I'll call them. Now George is on the stand. His story, shockingly, very different.
Yes, doesn't match.
It doesn't seem to line up here. So he said that it was Edward who often talked of killing girls, especially ones who rejected him, as well as other people who angered him. But George insisted that he never took it seriously. He knew that Edward had mental issues. He thought he was just talking. As for the night of the murders, George's claim is that Edward had shown up at his apartment, distraught, asking George to play some soothing music for him, which again, this is something that they did apparently all the time. If Edward was struggling, George would play music. They drove around, but when they got to the music building, there were lights on. They knew somebody was in that building, so then they drove around more, went back to George's apartment, talked a few minutes, and then Edward had left. George said he knew nothing of the killings until the next morning. The jury deliberated for 1 hour before telling the judge they could not reach a verdict. They were instructed to keep deliberating, but 90 minutes later, they reported they were hopelessly deadlocked and a mistrial was declared, which leads us to a second trial in April of 1950. I'm going to hit just a few of the highlights from the second trial. This time, Edward's mother, Ella, offered very different opinions regarding Edward's sanity.
Right.
She said her son had some peculiar ideas, but his mind was sound as a dollar, and it was all George's bad influence and power over him that were his main problems. She said the family had some mental illness in it, but, nothing that bad. And she said it was her husband's issues after the car accident, the health problems, rather than any mental issues that prompted his death. Okay.
I mean, you got to give it to Mom. She's going to tell whatever story it takes.
She really is.
That's where he gets his theatrics from.
So Edward was again brought in to testify. By this time, he was now incarcerated at the LaGrange Reformatory.
Wow.
Another connection.
Yep.
And both his and George's testimony were actually pretty similar to what they had said in the first trial.
Yeah.
Okay, but when it came time to deliberate, there was an unexpected twist. The judge gave in to the prosecutors, who asked at the last minute that the verdict of voluntary manslaughter be added as an option. Now, the defense vehemently argued against this last-minute change. First of all, because that wasn't even a charge against George throughout the entire trial. It was just tacked on at the end, so the defense had never even had a chance to try to address it.
Right.
Also, Paul Huddleston, the attorney, was afraid that it might be kind of a catch-all type verdict. If they wanted to punish George, if they thought he was guilty of something, but they didn't feel like
He deserved full murder.
Right. This could be something they would be like, well, we'll just give him that.
Yeah.
But the judge decided to leave that option on the table. And then 30 minutes after deliberation had begun, the jury filed back in because they said they needed further instruction. And they actually just wanted to ask one question, which was, quote, "Judge, we wonder if you'd tell us what the word homosexual means." The judge didn't answer. He just simply instructed them to deliberate based on the instructions they'd already received and, just go on back. But George's attorney was very concerned because based on that question and the fact that at that time, homosexuality itself was often viewed as a crime,
Right.
he feared that the jurors were going to make a decision based on George's relationship with Edward rather than on whether or not he had committed the murders,
Right,
which was
right.
what the trial was about.
Right.
The next morning, the jury came back in with a verdict of, you guessed it, guilty of manslaughter, with the sentence being 11 years in the penitentiary.
Yeah.
So George's attorney immediately filed a motion asking for a new trial, which was denied, and that meant waiting for a final verdict from the Kentucky Court of Appeals. In the meantime, the extortion charge against George was dropped, which was basically because Olga had moved out.
She didn't want to pursue
She
it.
just didn't want to pursue it. Yeah, she was in a different state at this time in a new job. So in February of 1951, 10 months later, the state appeals court overturned George Daggett's conviction, saying the verdict was a miscarriage of justice. They gave several reasons for their ruling. I'll give you just a couple. First, they questioned Edward's reliability as a witness and pointed out there was no corroboration for his testimony. Secondly, they said the judge should not have allowed the jury to find George guilty of a crime that he had not been charged with. And a third note was that the jury's question about the definition of homosexuality also showed evidence of prejudice. The ball was in the prosecutor's court, and they decided that rather than hold a third trial a month later, they said, nope, we're done, and all charges against George Daggett were formally dismissed, and he was released from jail. So when I was reading Wes's book, and I reached this point, I remember thinking, okay, that's the end of the story.
But it's not.
But it was not.
Oh my gosh.
In fact, there are a few more twists and turns coming, but we're not going to tell those today. We are going to hold those because remember, we are going to be talking with Wes next week. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to let him tell you some of those little surprise twists that are still coming. And then, of course, we're going to ask him a whole lot more questions because I cannot wait to analyze this story.
This was nuts. This story was nuts.
It absolutely was.
But I gotta say, I don't know what your armchair is, one of the heroes in this book to me was Daggett's lawyer, Huddleston. He was phenomenal.
He was great.
He was phenomenal.
Yeah, he was a very... And we didn't share this because I'm going to say it for like the fourth time. Read the book because there are so many details you are not getting to hear from us here. The book is so good.
It is.
But they share that he was not even experienced. He was coming into this as a novice.
Yep.
And boy, did he come through.
And his brief, that the appeals brief went down in the annals of history as like one of the best briefs that had ever been written. And it was his first one. And they have it in the appendix of this book. And I have read it. And after reading it, I was like, yup, I agree with you. Set George Daggett free. So he
did a great job.
Great job.
Yeah.
Armchair Psychologist.
Well, the question I was actually going to ask you, because I actually don't want us to armchair too much or give too many opinions because we're going to be talking and analyzing next week with Wes. So I was going to simply ask you, what are some of the questions you're looking forward to discussing with him or to asking him?
Well, okay, you haven't dwelt on her very much, but my main question coming out of this, without revealing more of the twists and turns, is I want to know more about Ruth. That's my main burning question is what? Just that.
Yeah.
Like, what in the world? What was her actual involvement, does he think? And what's up with the last part of her life? What is up?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I would also like to discuss more about George and his level of
involvement or lack of involvement.
Exactly. I'd like to to kind of dig into that a little bit more. I mean, all of it. I have so many questions I want to ask him.
Well, let me ask you this. At this point, before we talk to him, what do you think George's level of involvement was? Can we say that?
I will say that reading the book, Wes did such an amazing job of being objective.
Yeah, he did.
And I could see his journalistic background because he was presenting the evidence, he was presenting the facts, he was keeping his opinions out of it until towards the end of the book, which I loved. I thought that was great. Reading evidence only, there was absolutely no proof to me that George was involved. Edward kept changing his stories. Everything seemed to, like, even his first confession, the evidence lined up. I mean, so many of the things that he said had no corroboration. Anybody could have claimed it. And so I was like, there is nothing to prove that George was involved. This is unfair. He should be set free. I was taken aback when it said that he confessed to the extortion.
Yeah.
Because when they said that he admitted he'd been involved, and now that was just one sentence in the book. That's why I want to talk to Wes. But it said something about the attorneys admitted said he admitted he was involved. That made me think, was he was he encouraging him in some way?
Yeah.
You know, if he was not an accomplice, did he have knowledge? Did he somehow foster the idea, or knowing that Edward had mental issues, did he in some way encourage and nudge him a little bit?
Right. I mean, I'm with you. I don't think he was there that night because I've read the brief and I don't feel like he was on the property. I wonder if he knew that his friend was a little unbalanced, and I wonder if when Edward started talking about this stuff, if he sort of indulged him.
Right.
And I mean, you know, we saw that Alfred Hitchcock movie last year where we watched Shadow of a Doubt, where the two neighbors would talk to each other like, "How would you kill me? How would you kill me?"
Right.
And they were just talking.
Right.
I wonder if George would just indulge Edward and say, like, "Yeah, if this happened, we would do this," and he was just trying to soothe him, and he play his music and whatnot. From the way he reacted in the book, like, there's details about how he was just openly weeping. It, to me, his reaction felt like somebody who's like, I did not know this was going to happen. And then the evidence shows that showed that he wasn't there that night. I just think he was a person who made friends with a guy that, yeah, they did something they shouldn't have, but just because he did that doesn't mean that he escalated it to murder. Feels like he had an unbalanced friend that he was humoring, and the unbalanced friend mixed up some stuff in his mind and thought, well, this is what's going to happen, and went through with these plans. So that's how I came across at the end of the book. I felt like he may have inadvertently given him these ideas or done something, but it wasn't purposeful. I didn't feel like that was his personality.
It's so interesting to me how one sentence
changes your mind.
Could change my mind, because I was 100% team George's innocent.
And I will admit, I don't remember that sentence. So to me, when you said he admitted, I was like, oh, he did? I don't remember reading that. So I am not remembering that, and that could be coloring my experience.
Well, I want to go back and check the book now to make sure that, because...
Well, Wes will tell us.
Yes, absolutely. But I will say that I felt like, goodness, I mean, Edward has changed his story so many times. I'm not believing a word this man says, and he seems to have some pretty serious issues psychologically. So I was convinced George was innocent. His demeanor, taking care of his mom, everything made him seem innocent until I got to that point, and I'm like, wait a minute, if this is a person who would do this, now I'm considering him in a new light, because that was, again, it's one sentence, and I need to go check the book and make sure that I read that correctly.
Well, even if you didn't, that's just your opinion at this point. That would change your mind of somebody who could do this. If they can do this small thing, could they do this big thing?
Right. It just makes me wonder. On a totally different note, I want to, at least if you'll indulge me, briefly mention how interesting it was to see the murder mansion in person.
Yeah, tell me.
Just really briefly. Wes did such a beautiful job of describing this in the book, but there's something about seeing it in person. When he described it so well that you're just driving along this road and you have a lot of, lovely but modest homes that are, normal size homes. And then suddenly in the midst of that, here is this tall, grand,
opulent.
Yes. And it's just gorgeous. This gorgeous home, stately, with this drive that kind of, this little half circle or whatever in front of it. It was almost just kind of out of nowhere. I parked across the street at a church and walked down the sidewalk so that I could stand across from it and look at it. And it's kind of set back in the trees. And I'm just like, wow. Okay. And it put me in that mindset of, okay, then these neighbors are like just one of these homes probably just down the road. It was probably where the McKinneys lived. Yeah. And here's this big mansion. So that got me thinking. And then I drove into, there's like kind of a subdivision behind it. And so I drove there and I'm like, you know what? This house used to be sitting on, 200 and some acres?
A lot.
And now the back of the house literally backs up to one of these subdivision roads. And I'm like, I bet you I'm going to see the back of this house if I just go one of these streets. I did. Ooh. I drove up that street and you're like, house. Literally, the back of their outbuildings, of that home's outbuildings, are right there on the street. That close. Like I'm looking at this white building, which I think like one part looked like the back of maybe the garage and one part looked like an outbuilding. Like I think in her audio, Christy referred to it as a shed. But it's gorgeous. Yeah. I mean, it's really pretty, but it's right on the street. And then you go past it and it's house. It really, I don't know how to say this, but like it was affecting, It
brought history to life to you.
Yes,
it made
it so personal. And it's so sad because I really looked hard to try to find pictures of C.B. Martin and his wife. Yeah. I wanted to pay respect to them. They seem like such lovely people, such respectable, caring people who were also smart and accomplished. And it just was like, here's where this happened to them. It was a good experience for me to get to go see it in person and to make it even more real and affecting than it already was to me.
Well, I'm really glad you got to go.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings us to a close. And it makes me think in terms of who we want to give a shout out to. First of all, these were lovely people who were tragically and horrifically killed, and they did not deserve it. So I feel like I want to give a shout out to the people who pursued it, to the people who tried to make justice happen, and also to people like Wes who record this and who help preserve history and keep the memory alive.
I agree. So let's raise our cup and give a cheers to Wes and all the people who keep history alive.
Cheers.
Cheers.
If you love what we do, please rate and review our show. Or you can become a supporter by making a donation through buymeacoffee.com/scandalwaterpod. Whether a single gift or a recurring monthly donation, it would go a long way towards supporting our work and allowing us to keep the tea brewing.
At our website, www.scandalwaterpodcast.com, you can submit questions or your own story ideas, access our sources and show notes, see the merch we offer for sale, and more. You can join the Scandal Water community through our Scandal Water Podcast Facebook page or follow us on Instagram or TikTok at Scandal Water Podcast.
This episode was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown,
that's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
A special thank you to Josh Martin, who wrote, composed, and performed the Scandal Water theme and other music. Matt C. Adams, who created the artwork, and Joshua Reith, who designed our website and provides ongoing technical support.
As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers, or clearly professional psychologists. Thanks for listening.